I think we have an awesome group combining compliance and privacy. Let's kick it off with some intros. I'll throw it to Anna.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Tom. Hello, everybody. My name is Anna Say, and I am the U.S. Head of Compliance at Laser Digital. It is the crypto asset arm of Nomura. Prior to joining Laser, I was the Chief Compliance Officer at Gemini. I was the Deputy Chief Compliance Officer at Gemini and the Chief Compliance Officer for Gemini Trust Company. Before entering the crypto space, I sort of held various roles within TradFi, and like some of my other panelists here, I'm also an attorney by training. I started off my career as an assistant district attorney at the district attorney's office in Brooklyn.
Hi, I'm Matthias. I'm with Bermuda. We are a privacy protocol, and we are built on ZK, and we're using Noir as our core infrastructure. We are an SDK that essentially integrates into wallets, but also integrates with assets. We're very composable, and we are particularly invested into facilitating the onboarding of institutions into the space. We have a slightly different approach that allows us to make the reach of institutions much wider. And yeah, looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Linda?
Hello, I'm Linda Jeng. I am the Chief Legal and Policy Officer at Aave Labs. We're the core service provider of the Aave protocol, which is the largest decentralized lending protocol. And before I even go further, I need to ask, what's the name of this panelist?
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Eric, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Hi, my name is Eric. I'm a privacy and DeFi lawyer. I'm working now mainly with something called the Private Proof of Innocence, which is a verification and trust layer for DeFi. It's an aggregator. If you can generate a proof, then you know your origin is not suspect, basically.
Thank you, Eric. And my name is Dom Zagara. I started my career as a consultant. I helped draft the Wyoming Special Purpose Depository Institution Manual. Then I worked at NYDFS, built out some of the blockchain analytics and stablecoin controls. And most recently, as a consultant, I helped set up California's DFAL evaluation system. And this is Blaze. He helps me with my diabetes. He shouldn't cause many distractions, but fun fact, not sure how the privacy bros are going to feel about this, but his vaccination records are currently on the blockchain. I'm working on trying to get those as a proof of concept for verifiable credentials. But unfortunately, this panel is not about the good of blockchain. It's about the dark side. It's about when sanctions violations occur and when liability comes up. And as we've heard from the last panel, there have been a lot more exploits in the age of AI. And we see North Korea hacking, moving funds, and the big question that a lot of regulators are asking is, where does responsibility fall? And I think this panel is in a great position to talk about that. I think it would be best to actually start with Eric on the privacy side. Who's responsible for stopping these exploits? Where does the buck stop?
I think
Oh, yeah, we don't have to touch it.
okay. There we go. So I guess the first thing is that I feel like at these events we lump all the different kinds of sort of malicious acts into one, and the reality is different types of acts require a different response, right? So if it's a blocked property, well then everybody has a duty to do something about it. If it might be stolen property, that's not the same thing in the details, right? And so, and then even more speculative things there, you know, like in the traditional sense, if it's only speculative, you go to the bank, it passes right through the bank, they just raise something, they look into it after the fact, and 120 days later, they escalate it to the authority and say, hey, 120 days ago, this thing happened over here, and I think it might have been suspect, right? And you've done your duty. Your duty ends right there, right? And so, but to your question, you know, I think it's very much dependent about what it is, right? And so the quick answer is, you know, sort of in the DeFi space where I'm working, the answer is simply to block it from using your thing rather than, you know, say it says go somewhere else, don't come here, you know, which is one possibility. If everybody does that, then you just end up with something you can't use. You know, there's another possibility which we see elsewhere where they just freeze it, right? They just lock it. They flip the stablecoins, especially just flip a switch and they can just freeze it temporarily or permanently. And I let other people speak to that. But who's responsible? Everybody has some responsibility, but to what degree, I think it really varies on this theme that I'm going in circles on here, which is just, it just depends what the event is.
Nuance is super, super important.
Yeah.
Linda, what do you think?
Well, so as someone who joined Aave Labs only a few weeks before the Kelp DAO incident, and this is all public, it was really interesting to me because who remembers the global financial crisis from 18 years ago? Well, I do. I was in government when that happened, and it was really interesting to be at Aave Labs and have to bail ourselves out. And we ended up spearheading the DeFi United Coalition. But the exploit did not happen on the Aave protocol. It happened outside of the protocol. But the bad debt ended up with us. And so I'm only speaking to what's already public. Now, looking back, we're still in the process of assessing, doing postmortems, improving, and expanding our asset listing standards, which we recently released our technical asset listing standard. As Eric was saying, compliance is actually multi-layered. You have a tech stack that is base layer, L2s, DeFi protocols, interfaces, and then you have blockchain analytic firms, you have custodians, you have centralized exchanges. Everyone has a role, but it's about applying the right type of control at the right layers.
Another excellent answer, very nuanced. I can appreciate that. I'm sure the regulators will as well. Matthias, what about you?
Yeah, I totally agree. I guess from a product perspective, we are very conscious of what it means to enforce rules and regulations and prevent this trend from happening, which is essentially pushing responsibilities down the stack or up the stack, but in most cases down the stack. And we see a lot of conversations at the protocol level whether freezes are right or not, and often they're an outcome of the absence of effective controls at the points where they should have been. From our perspective, as a privacy protocol, we have a lot of focus on introducing effective verification at the point of when something happens. So when you think of the transaction lifecycle, there are a lot of interactions that are taking place between users and protocols, between users and users. And often these incidents happen without any sort of interference. And we uniquely have the ability, using ZK, to actually enforce specific rules at the point of interaction, which can prevent many of the freezes and sort of like retroactive actions that are taking place. So from my perspective, at the very minimum, we should differentiate between the protocol layer and the application layer. And specifically thinking of stablecoins, I guess there are different kinds of stablecoin designs. But at some point, there is, I guess, a fundamental question around the role of these protocols, the role of what money really is. And if we have arbitrary ways of interfering with the flow of funds, then sometimes they're destroying the very purpose of those products. And so if we have more effective controls at the application layer, we can prevent that from being a problem, but we can also more effectively enforce the rules.
I like it. Anna, how about you?
Thanks. I mean, I think really just to echo what everyone has been saying, as participants in the digital asset ecosystem, we all have a strong inherent interest, right, to ensure that the platforms and that our ecosystem is not being used for any illicit or nefarious purposes. And I think what types of controls we need to implement and what is required and necessary to monitor, to detect, to report any type of illicit activity depends in part of what information you have access to, and depends on whether or not you have control in the movement of funds. And I think what is sort of interesting that we're seeing in this space, and something that both I think Eric and Matthias has sort of alluded to, is that there's now an increased amount of sophistication in the type of technology and tooling that we're able to use for purposes like transaction monitoring or like wallet screening, which really enables like all providers to be able to implement risk-based controls that are both, appropriate and proportionate to the services that are being provided.
If I could, yeah. So I think about some examples of things you can do in all the conversations I had with regulators over the years. So before this, I used to work in liquid staking, or I advised liquid staking. And so when I would explain that Lido has 10 oracles, not one, they'd say, like, where's the risk? And I'd say, well, these guys over here have one oracle, so that's dangerous. They have 10. And they have a polling that says if 5 of 10 report and they're all the same, to rebase. And that's a risk mitigation control about being exploited, right? In PPY, again, it has sort of a bit of a scale. It's like the beginning of something that's interesting, right? Which is you try to shield in, so you use a wallet. The main client is Railgun. So you try to shield in and get privacy, but then it blocks you for 60 minutes and runs a token trace for 60 minutes, so you can't outrun the hack. And then if you come out clean, it'll give you a note that says these funds, didn't get picked up in a trace. But if you don't generate the note, it gives you only one option. So this is the beginning of building something. It only allows you to revert to origin. So now you have somebody who's on the blockchain, vanished, and comes back 61 minutes later with the exact same balance. That's a 0-day bad actor address that has never been discovered before. And so that's kind of contributing to the discovery of what's going on. On the DeFi side, it does something, this is relatively new. If you want to swap, like it allows you to do a swap, but if your swap is greater than 10% difference for slippage and fees, if it's less than 10%, it just lets you swap. But if it's greater than 10%, it makes you run the full PPY 60-minute block. And then if you can't generate that proof, you can't revert to origin now. It actually gets hung. And
Sounds like a freeze to me.
Yeah. And so so these are like just the beginning of some complex tooling, that has incremental based on behaviors that are automatically executed without a human in the loop, really. And so it's only we're just in the infancy of this, but it can be built, right?
I think that's fascinating, and I know we just talked about 10 minutes of all the bad stuff that happens in crypto, but the other side of that is these programmable compliance controls that are, like you just alluded to, haven't been seen in traditional finance before, and maybe can actually do better at stopping financial crime than the tools that we do have in traditional finance. There's been some great examples of very big banks getting fined billions of dollars for laundering money, facilitating illicit loans. I'd love to hear, Linda, we can go straight to you for this one. What is the next generation look like? What programmable tools can we use to prevent the mistakes that led to traditional finance failures?
Well, I loved what Eric was talking about, because when regulators hear privacy, they just think, that's a bad word. They're trying to hide illicit activities. But in fact, these privacy technologies that Eric and Matthias are building, they really should be viewed as forms of selective disclosure and actually proactive compliance tools. And so I anticipate that these will actually become very normal part of the compliance tech stack, and not only on-chain, but also by traditional financial institutions, who will also see that this is actually a very cost-effective compliance tools that they can integrate into what they're doing already.
Privacy coming soon to Aave. That's exciting.
Well, I'm only speaking personally because I'm also, I didn't mention this, I'm a visiting scholar at Georgetown Law, and just last week I held a roundtable on privacy-enhancing technologies and how decentralized identity can be actually plugged into on-chain compliance and potentially at the smart contract level. But that's my research hat.
That's a fun research hat. We should talk about that. That'll be fun. Matthias, how about you? talk to me about what you're doing at Bermuda. What cool new stuff are you guys cooking up to make sure that people don't have to expose how much money they have to anyone with an internet connection?
Yeah, I think the points that you just made are actually very important. I think generally the compliance conversation is one of the most underappreciated conversations that we can have in Web3, specifically when it comes to bringing institutions on board. From our perspective as a privacy protocol, we have very effective ways of enforcing compliance. And I think one of the, biggest existing design flaws that we have in the compliance world is the fact that we mostly rely on observability. And existing institutions have to observe huge amounts of information, most of which is actually not required, and it's an infringement on privacy, but it is necessary in order to enforce rules, and in most instances, or not in most instances, but in many instances, it then is not effective, and we have to have retroactive actions such as freezes. What we are building, ignoring the privacy component, a ZK protocol has the unique abilities to essentially enforce verifiability at the point whenever an asset moves, and we can enforce any arbitrary rule at the very point when those assets move, which means ultimately that we can adhere to issue specific policies, we can adhere to any form of regulatory policies that are supposed to apply. And the big benefit of ZK, and specifically what we're building at Bermuda, is that we can have one protocol layer that offers global liquidity, and we can enforce multiple policies at the same time, which means we can enforce policies from different issuers. We can enforce policies on a jurisdictional basis, and it sort of allows much more economic efficiency, because all of a sudden we have a global liquidity layer, and we can enforce the rules whenever they need to be enforced. That, from my perspective, is a much more effective way of enforcing compliance, and it brings a lot of economic benefits in doing that. And we can prevent silos from existing. You know, we have many privacy protocols that are effectively confined in their reach, because the enforceability is really restricted to their sort of like operating world. But in our case, we're very agnostic. We are operating across EVM, and that allows us to essentially facilitate movement across any EVM chain, which is very wide.
One quick follow-up for you, Matthias. I read through the Ethereum Foundation's CROPS framework. When that came out, how did you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's very good that we are sort of trending in that direction. I think it's very helpful for Ethereum sort of go down this direction, and I think this CROPS framework helps everyone to think about the same. I think having a common mental framework is very important, and I think it's very easy to understand, and therefore I think it helps with general alignment between the Web3 builders and the institutions that are coming on board. From a privacy perspective, there has been traditionally always a bit of a friction point between sort of the cypherpunk community and the institutions, which were very much unaligned in terms of values. And I think now that's an opportunity to sort of realign, and with that realignment, we'll see infrastructure being built that is actually an extension and an advancement of traditional financial infrastructure that I think helps with a lot of financial adoption at a broader scale.
Yeah, interesting. It's almost like they create this layer where they're not going to really have anything specialized. They're going to be very general, and then it creates opportunities for Bermuda to provide more specialized, like, policy.
Exactly.
Good job by you. Anna, let's wrap it up with how you see programmable compliance in digital assets.
Well, I mean, I think sort of what everyone is saying in talking about controls and the sophistication in terms of how these controls are built, it's really critical. And I think, you know, for any compliance program, it is based upon, you know, effective controls. But one thing that I think is that when we're thinking about some of the really severe AML and compliance deficiencies that, Dom, you've alluded to earlier, my view is it's not, when you see these types of issues, it is not just because that there was a control problem. There are usually more systemic issues that were underlying at some of these institutions. So I think, programmable controls and the sophistication of them is absolutely important. But for any compliance program, you would still need a strong culture of compliance within the organization. You need effective processes and strong governance framework to support all of those controls, which of course includes, programmable controls as well.
It's very holistic.
I do what I can.
Eric?
I see the possibility for what I call like a series of independent modular escalating protocols or controls, right? So if I just use the PPY at the base layer, you were denied privacy, you got kicked out into the wild. That you could go to some other business or protocol and say, hey, I got denied over here, but I'm actually innocent. So like I'm wrongly tagged. And that it's like a different level of escalation, but it's provided by somebody else, right? And then if you were able to then get cleared, if you will, at that point, that you could then come back and get privacy, right? And that there could be like a third higher level, right? It's kind of like a funnel. And I think traditionally we just think that this all occurs in one business, right? Like it's one desk to the next row to the next row to the next row. But I think in DeFi or in Web3, we may well find that the thing that works is when it's provided by these different layers or provided by different people. Where we say, my only responsibility is to do this one little thing. I collect a little tiny fee on that, and that's the thing that we do. And on the compliance side, that you just have to be willing to pay for it. Like, if you're like, I have a big sum and I want to get privacy, so I want to do, I don't want to have a wrench attack, but I get denied because I got flagged here, but I'm not sure by who. That there could be another layer, right? There's a demand for it, obviously, and especially if you think you've been wrongly flagged. Because I mean, at the early stage that we're at, somebody told me here. They said, yeah, I got flagged the other day. I couldn't get into Railgun, and it's from the same. And I said, oh, well, the way PPY works is we can't tell you. Even we don't know whether it was chain analysis, TRM. We don't know who flagged your address because we just aggregate the information. And so there's no recourse. That person just has to like abandon, and he is very clear that he's never done anything wrong. And I said, well,
That's not great, though.
it's not great. And so you can start to see that there's a need for like another, some wrong people can be tagged. I'll call it innocent people can be tagged, denied the private proof of innocence just because of the way the industry works. But it's just the beginning, and based on what I've seen for the last, few years, being in and around the space, is there's not really enough resource to like build the whole thing from top to bottom, and it's more likely to emerge as this modular thing. Like, sorry, didn't work here. Go see those guys, see what they can do if they build it.
Do you think that's a good thing?
I do, actually.
Tell me more.
I think it avoids bias, right? Which can be a problem in this space, and it keeps things relatively neutral. So, like you're going to re-enter with a suspicious tracing history that may or may not be justified, is the word I'm looking for. And so there's like somebody else that might be able to undo your problem and sort of re-bless this situation. And because at the moment, which is the automation, it just doesn't happen, right? And so it's not going to happen within the automated one, but there could be, like I said, some other layer that does it a different way and can free you somehow. Because, to get in contact and prove back to one of the corporate providers, analytics, that this was wrongly flagged is quite a challenge. And so, you're not going to do it yourself. It's unlikely. So.
No, certainly not. And I've seen the blockchain analytics vendors make mistakes. Sometimes it's bad attribution given by machines, and there's serious decisions that get made by that. Matthias or Linda, I see both
Well,
of you
I just wanted to just build off that a little bit more. Like Eric's already like thinking. Well, I mean, we're already in this future, but it's an ecosystem that already shows the travel rule does not work. And did anyone send a bank transaction today? Okay, nobody. Did you? Okay.
Corsage for high school graduation. Just sent it.
So which bank to which bank?
2 banks in Canada.
All right. Well, okay, maybe. No, actually, they would still be subject to FATF guidance. The bank you used when they sent that transaction to the other bank as part of the travel rule compliance had to send your information to the receiving bank. And so every time you make a payment transaction, whether it's ACH, wire transfer, whatever, your bank has to send your information to the recipient bank. Clearly doesn't work because $6 billion later, last year, that's how much they spent on illicit finance compliance. US banks stopped less than, 1% of illicit activities? And so it's very expensive, it doesn't work, and then they are trying to apply it to self-custodial finance. And again, this is why, verification through ZK proofs maybe at the transactional level could be very interesting. And this is where we can probably see and demonstrate how much better cryptographic tools are for compliance.
Yeah, 100%. I think they're extremely effective, and you can aggregate so many data sources in real time without necessarily disrupting the user flow. I definitely agree on that front. There's also a risk when it comes to having better enforceability, which is essentially that you can potentially abuse the system. There's always this question in terms of, okay, if I have this mechanism, who can use that mechanism to actually abuse it in a certain way? And that's why I think diversification is also very helpful. Using multiple providers to have some form of neutrality involved. And again, I think the separation between the protocol level and the application level is very important, because otherwise we fall into the trap that we absorb a very subjective perspective in terms of what rules need to be enforced. We are exposed to a certain part of the world, but that's not the entirety of the world, and we shouldn't have the aspiration to sort of serve only a fraction of the global user base. And I think we can fall easily into the trap of doing that by choosing the wrong layer where we are going to enforce those rules. And I think there are a lot of benefits, economic benefits, globally from stablecoins, and therefore being mindful of the fact in terms of how they can seamlessly flow across the world while being able to adhere to rules at a different layer is something that is very important.
I couldn't agree more. Part of the struggle being a regulator is trying to balance, we want innovation, but how do we do it responsibly?
I mean, I think I really agree with that, and Linda really just touched upon a topic of travel rule that's just near and dear to me. And I think, for so many of us who are familiar with the travel rule, you really see that, it is essentially a record-keeping requirement, right? That was
Paper blockchain.
paper, right? It's a record-keeping requirement that was for wire transactions. That was how it was developed. That was what it was trying to capture. And then when you're trying to implement or adopt that sort of framework to crypto transactions, you really see all the different friction points and the areas where it just doesn't quite work, right? So some of the things that Eric and Linda and Matthias are all talking about is how can we have better tooling and more innovative tooling that can still satisfy what we're trying to achieve, which is to actually be able to trace transactions from point A to point B to point C without trying to sort of use the proverbial round peg or square hole or square pole round peg. I think everyone knows what I'm trying to say. But how do we actually be able to satisfy that requirements, but utilizing more innovative technology? And I think that's something that's super interesting that my fellow panelists here are developing.
Well, I will say privacy is becoming more and more of a thing that appears to be necessary for crypto holders. In preparation for this, I saw that France, through mid-April, had 40 wrench attacks that were originally started because people were able to identify large balances on chain. That's something that privacy can help solve. Right, Eric?
Yeah. So this topic raises two things that where I have like a controversial opinion. One is I refer to the travel rule as a paper blockchain. Right, I'm gathering this historical information about what went where, when, so I can look it up someday in the future. Well, guess what? That's what the blockchain does. It just stamps it. The second thing is about the fallacy of contamination, right? So when a bank like TD Bank gets fined $3.9 billion for non-compliance and letting through bad funds, every person who has an account there, ever used TD Bank or was a counterpart, is not contaminated.
Maybe they should all be frozen.
And the reason, and one of the very obvious reasons that if everybody who ever transacted as a counterparty to a bank that let through, $500 billion worth of illicit funds, it would mean there would be a liquidity crisis on a scale on the planet that nobody could ever buy milk, right?
Do you want to send us all to the gulag for being counterparties?
Yeah. And so there's this very weak narrative that nobody ever really pokes holes at, which is what I call the fallacy of the contamination theory. Mm-hmm. That just because some potentially or truly contaminated tokens brushed your protocol in a minute amount, that somehow the whole thing is contaminated. Mm-hmm. And that it's really unhelpful, and it's a bit of an uphill battle. So I like to mention everywhere I go, because people are like, oh, that's right. When the bank moves, so this is how the actual system works. So why are we trying to invent some other system? And usually the people who are pushing that are people who are selling analytics. You don't usually often see the regulator or a legal law enforcement authority kind of saying that. And so it is a challenge to be navigated and overcome in the space, is what I call the fallacy of the contamination theory.
Do you know what I call it? I explained this this position, this OFAC position, to our engineers. I call it the poop in the swimming pool analogy. I say, yeah, the way OFAC sees it is a baby pooped in the pool, and now suddenly the entire pool is tainted. But the truth is, that's actually not the case. Just because there was some money laundering that accidentally got into the pool,
that was found out much later in time,
does not mean the entire protocol is tainted. If you were to apply what they did to Tornado Cash to TD Bank, everyone at TD Bank should have been frozen.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that raises the question, Tornado Cash does have a compliance function. If you put money in Tornado Cash, you can get the on-chain trail. Theoretically, you could provide that to your bank, and maybe they'll onboard you. But there must have been some lessons that privacy protocols learn from the sanctions designation of Tornado Cash. Matthias and Eric, I'll let you go first.
Tornado Cash is really the representation of cypherpunk, and there are a lot of different ways in how you can design a privacy protocol. I think Tornado Cash as a mixer stands by itself. We at Bermuda have a very different approach. You can achieve privacy very effectively without mixing funds in a way that they are not identifiable. And in fact, instead of a mixer, we have more of a spaghetti approach, which essentially allows us to really identify funds whenever they need to be identified, in a way that we are, without going too much into the details, but essentially being able to give deposits a status, and that status can be retroactively identified if it misses a compliance check.
Nice.
And so it prevents the funds from being tainted and being mingled with other funds. So to your point, there's no incidence of where we have funds that are either being stuck in the pool, and then people say, oh, now the pool has been contaminated and we cannot interact with the entire pool. And essentially then we allow the bad funds to be withdrawn from the pool, but in a way that they are traceable, which then allows law enforcement to actually interfere and do whatever they want to do with the funds. So there are very different designs in how to facilitate privacy, and from our perspective, we start more with a compliance verification first angle, and then the privacy becomes sort of the byproduct, and it becomes a lot more effective, and it's more intended to introduce more integrity into the system rather than obfuscating funds to the extent that they avoid laws and regulations.
That sounds like a magnificent innovation. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Anna, I'll give you the last word on everything we've talked about.
That seems like quite a bit of pressure. But I think, one of the prevailing themes we're seeing here today, it's really the, convergence, if you will, of both, compliance as well as privacy, and that these two things do not have to be mutually exclusive. And I think from the work that sort of everyone is doing here on the, on the stage here today, it's really an illustration of that. And I think, even more so, like education in this area is also just critically important for people to understand, like how these privacy protocol sort of like operates, how the different controls that are being built out and developed to prevent it from being misused as well. And I think both of these things are just critical to continue to have this dialogue and have this conversation to just really foster just better understanding.
That's a great way to end it. Thank you very much, Anna.